1961 through 1991 were busy years in terms of music at LABC. We begin in 1962 when Alfred Kanwisher presented a piano concert at LABC. In March of 1963, the joint choirs of First Baptist Rochester and LABC performed Gabriel Faur's Requiem at LABC. Around that same time, the junior choir boasted 50 members. We have some wonderful pictures of some of those members of the day. Also in March of 1963, the Organ Committee was formed and made an extensive report on the planned purchase of a new organ. The committee toured a number of churches across the United States to consider organs by various makers. Visits included First Methodist of Syracuse and First Presbyterian of Utica. On July 8, 1963, the Organ Committee settled on the purchase of a Casavant Frères organ at a cost of $63,790. In 1964, the organ was installed. On December 5, 1964, the new organ was dedicated. On January 31, 1965, the LABC choir sang for Mass at the Blessed Sacrament Church. In March of 1965, Jay Peterson, a senior at the Eastman School of Music and pupil of David Craighead, performed an organ recital. Continuing in that tradition of organ recitals, on May 10, 1966, 600 people attended a performance by Pierre Cochereau, organist from Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. It was on June 12 of 1967 that Marlo Smith retired from his position as Director of Music at LABC after 32 years of service. Just a few months later, the new choir director, David Conley, and organist Richard Stewart were announced. Just a few weeks later, a retirement party organized by Norma Stoneham, a choir member, took place in celebration of the ministry of Marlo Smith. Continuing in ecumenical service, under the direction of Mr. Conley, in 1968 the choirs of LABC, Christ Presbyterian, and St. Anthony presented a Palm Sunday afternoon concert. In June of '68, Mr. Conley resigned as choir director and Mr. Lane was hired. Just a few months later, the Messiah was presented augmented by an orchestra composed of members from the RPO and the Eastman School Senior Orchestra to a packed house. And it was in April of 1969 that with assistance from the Penfield Community Orchestra and supplemental singers, Mozart's Requiem was performed. In June of 1969, Dick Stewart resigned as organist and Michael Corzine was hired. Shortly thereafter, in November of 1969, in collaboration with the Genesee Symphony Orchestra of Batavia, a German Requiem by Brahms was performed at Batavia High School and a second time at LABC. In 1969, a youth choir was reestablished, making its first appearance at the Christmas Eve service. And our records show that in June 1970, Mr. Ralph Lane resigned his position as choir director, and Mr. Paul Berry from the music faculty at Roberts Wesleyan College was hired for the position. Some of the many happenings between 1970 and 1972 involve our youth. The youth choir was disbanded when an attempt to secure a leader from the congregation failed, as was a ministry called Music Modules, an attempt in the church school program. Unfortunately, it failed when a resource person was unable to be recruited. And we know that from 1972, after the fire, new hymnals were purchased to replace those lost in the fire. And we're aware that several churches loaned or helped give music to reestablish the music library. In 1973, the organist and music director resigned at almost the same time. Former director Marlo Smith stepped in to fill the void. In 1974, after the purchase of new choir robes were ordered and in preparation of moving into the new building, Ross Wood, an Eastman graduate student, was hired at that time as organist. Here we have a couple of images of the installation of the new organ. That new organ, a Holt Kemp organ, was dedicated with Russell Saunders playing the recital. Not long thereafter, in 1975, choir director Vicki Lutz resigned, and Richard Wilder, director of vocal music at West Irondequoit High School, was hired to replace her. Here we have an image of John Andrews, who celebrated his 40th year singing in the choir. Next year, in 1979, organist Brenda Ferry resigned in November and was replaced by Barbara Verdeek. 4 years later, in 1983, she resigned and was followed by Craig Phillips. Once again, on December 4th of that year, a joint Advent service was presented by the joint choirs of LABC and First Baptist Church, Rochester. Finally, on June 26, 1983, the celebrated group, West Virginians from Alderson Broaddus College, filled worship with their musical message.